it's a really important one. There are a number of reasons that I think help to explain why this situation has come about. One is the obvious reform that's been undertaken within Europe itself, starting with the McSharry reforms, but continuing since then. The second one that's been really important is that since about 2000, we've been going through a period where world food prices have been increasing and are at historically high levels. And that's had two consequences. One is that the level of subsidies provided by all the major subsidisers around the world has gone down. And farmers that were previously significantly affected by subsidised competition in third country markets are now no longer being affected in the same way. And so that's taken away a whole lot of the domestic pressure that existed in Australia and in a range of other countries to focus on, to target, to oppose the subsidies and other measures that were being undertaken by the European community. And so that's helped reduce significantly the common agricultural policy as an irritant in the relationship. And another important development in my view is the fact that with the coming into being of the World Trade Organization, we have an international organisation that not only sets rules, but also for the first time and uniquely amongst international organisations has the capacity to make binding judgments. And so what this has done is to give members of the WTO the confidence that they can bring disputes or they can threaten to bring disputes, knowing that they will get a ruling eventually and that that ruling will be implemented in almost all cases. The European Union knows that it's not in some, both by themselves and by the Americans, so it's not perfect, but the compliance rate is well above 95%. And you can see that. Australia tried to bring challenges against the European Union sugar regime back in the 1980s, was unable to get any satisfaction because at that time you had to get the agreement of the party that you wanted to bring the dispute against. Why would a party want to agree to have a dispute brought against it? The system changed when we went from the GATT to the WTO. Australia, Thailand, Brazil successfully brought a dispute against the European Union over sugar, and we've seen reforms made which have helped change the world market and reduce this as an irritant in the bilateral relationship. So to my mind, these are really important developments that have removed what was a major irritant in the relationship and helped transform it into one that's now much more focused on constructive issues, working together. By the way, when people talk about John Howard and his concern about dealing with Europe and his focus on common agricultural policy, it's worth remembering that the very first ministerial portfolio that he held, Malcolm Fraser's government, was as the special trade negotiator for Australia, negotiating with just one country, one group with the EU. We had a minister whose sole responsibility was to negotiate trade problems with one other trading partner. We've never had that before, never had it since. He spent 2.5 years doing that job. That really influenced his view of Europe and the world. On the issue of the wine agreement, very interesting points were made there. One that came home very strongly to me was an adage that's well known to many trade negotiators, which is, and this was in reference to Edward's comment about Lachlan's comment about the difficulty that the Australian side had because the way that it had to negotiate with its own domestic industry. When I first started working on trade issues, my then boss, who was a very wily and experienced negotiator, said to me, the hardest negotiations are always at home. And it's very true. It's much more difficult to secure agreement with the industry whose interests you're representing than it is typically to negotiate with the other side, because the industry's interests are very narrowly focused, whereas the government has to take into account a much broader range of considerations. Yes, the wine industry is significant, but so are a whole range of other industries. Should we prioritise the wine industry's concerns over those of the dairy industry, beef producers, sugar exporters? These are the decisions that governments have to make that industry organisations don't have to worry about. So it's worthwhile bearing that point in mind. And finally, in relation to the presentation about media, one of the key issues in looking at the Australia's relationship with the European Union, the way that European Union issues to do with Europe are presented in Australia, is to recognise that the vast majority of media reporting that occurs in Australia is through the filter of London. So if you have a look at reports in the Australian media, they're either sourced from British newspapers or they're heavily influenced. And so what that means is that there's necessarily a Eurosceptic position that heavily influences what Australians hear about, see on their television and read about in relation to developments in Europe. And so this has been an issue for those of us inside the department in the last few years dealing with the crisis in Europe. We've been making the argument that the solution that Europe has had to all of the problems it's faced has been further integration, that the political imperative for the Eurozone to continue and for the European project to continue is so strong that we should be very sceptical of economists and political scientists and any commentators putting forward the argument that we'll have a Brexit or a UK exit or any of these other things happening. They may well happen, but the imperatives for continued integration are very strong, and that's typically not accurately reflected in the media reporting that we get here in Australia. And so it's an issue that anybody interested in European issues needs to confront and to deal with, and it would be really good if we had more reporters, whether Australian or not, who are based in Europe and able to report directly into the Australian media. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. Andrea, questions or comments?
Actually, I wanted to ask Eva and Edward, but also David just gave me the idea for this question. And by the way, I just thank all the presenters. I really enjoyed your presentation. But what I wanted to question essentially is whether the idea that criticism here in Australia of the current handling of, for instance, the euro crisis is really a fair criticism. Because I read the press, and yes, there are some occasions reading, for instance, what's his name, he writes for the Australian, Greg Sheridan. Of course there are exaggerations, but the question I want to put to you, is this criticism really unfair? I do understand that there's a certain London-based prism through which things are seen. But nonetheless, isn't it fair to ask ourselves whether, for instance, the Euro project was a mistake? I don't negate, for instance, each country's willingness to go further down the path of European integration. I can see that happening to some extent in Europe. But is it really, can we really criticize Australian journalists for pointing this problem out, which is a critical issue for the existence of the European Union? I would say it's a make or break it of European integration potentially. And to some extent, I would also argue, and here it's a Europhile, not a Eurosceptic, speaking truly and honestly. But is it unfair to, for instance, to portray the European monetary integration as a badly thought out project, a poorly executed one, and essentially a French project has gone pear-shaped? The attempt to contain German monetary policy, German foreign policy, and now it's perhaps Germany containing France. Quite successful, so just the other way around. So I just wanted to put this to you, just plays the devil's advocate.
Any comments? Oh. No, does anyone want to comment to
I would only ask.
I think you need to know.
If I could only comment on fair portrayal, how would you define it?
No, I'm just, I would ask you.
Because, okay, there are hundreds of stories, the ones I read, and some of them were talking about the same issue, and some of them were not true, simply. So, in some cases, yes, there was no fairness, because the person writing it had no idea. I don't know where he got the material he got, but it was not true. Or in other cases, when you simply copy and paste to the British viewers or listeners, and you don't change it, and you just sell it the same way, whether it might mean something else for your audience, I think you're doing injustice to your audience, to your readers, because they may not understand the same story, they may not want the events that you're describing may not mean the same to them as it means to the British people. So you as a journalist, I don't know, you shouldn't be doing it. But in the end, there's business going on as usual. Europe is, at the time when we were doing the research, Europe was Australia's first partner. So when the media was saying, what was it important? Not really. So I don't believe I'm saying this because I'm a former journalist. So to me, media should matter, they should be partnered for.
Andrea, and then Mike.
I mean, to answer to your question, I think maybe there are some fair points, but I think often it is a fairly narrow-minded vision, interpretation of things, of journalists who have also first of all, they don't understand how the European Union works. Because they think that a decision can be taken like that, whereas it's much more complicated, incremental, etc., etc. And also people who have a short memory, because after all, where did the global financial crisis originate? Not in Europe.
That's right.
I mean, certainly in Europe was not prepared to face it. But so I would say, in my opinion, there are maybe some fair points, but clearly quite a narrow-minded, short-term analysis, mainly very, very often. That's my opinion.
If I could also add something, because we talked to people from politics, from business sector, from civil society and media, it was only the media people who were the most negative. They hated the EU. That would be my feeling was that there was anger amongst them. I don't know. Something that we did not detect amongst politicians or people trading with Europe. So it was specifically that sector that showed a lot of negative feelings in the interviews that we had with them. So I thought, if this is what they feel, this is what they write, right? It influences what they write.
Notice there's another question. Can you pass it very
Can just at the back, and then I'll come back to you.
I want to help Eva to explain a bit. First of all, our project is not to criticize any media practice. As an academic, we're just finding and want to compare what media do when they report the European Union. So we're not criticizing Australian for using cheap news from The Guardian or from the Financial Times. This is how they practice, and we just report what we find. And then, look, I believe we all here, we are more educated part of the society. But emergent, we look at the Australian as the newspaper. We look at ABC News at 7 o'clock. The general public, they are not as educated. They won't really think, oh, they talk about EU like this. They have hidden agenda. They don't. They just receive whatever the journalists feed them, and then it is the result of our project. And then, indeed, I have to tell you, our questions in 2011 was not about the Eurozone crisis. We talk about, okay, so in 2009 they have the Lisbon Treaty signed, implement. So will that have an influence? But our finding is that, look, Australians don't, or the other places don't really care about that. It is the crisis which is really happening. And then for media, because we also do it in other countries like Singapore, Thailand, China, Japan, so a lot of, and Russia. It is easy to sell because you have these Greek people processing. They give you picture, they give you motion. So it's easier for them to sell, and then when, as a normal audience, when you read the news, it's easier for you to remember than something very complicated as Lisbon Treaty, they want to do this and that. So it's what we find. And then it's difficult because if Eva tell you the story here in Australia, you may find it a little bit difficult to understand. But then when you compare it with other countries, like the portraits with China, Chinese media, some of them, the Xinhua Agency, you have the People Daily, you have CCTV, they are so damn rich. they sent a lot of journalists to look at the EU from their own perspective. And then it reflected in the news that they look at EU from, they also report about the crisis because it's what really happening. But then they also try to talk to academic in Brussels, they talk to the commission people, they go to conferences, so they feed the audience with a little bit more other information. It is from the Chinese perspective. And then as Eva's slide showed that China also care a lot about EU trading as a trade partner because apparently China export a lot to EU. So when you put Australia in context internationally, then it gives it's different, and then we are not really criticizing what Australian media is doing, but then we are saying, oh, it's a finding for us, it's interesting, it's the result.
Thank you.
Just a comment from myself. I wonder, there's a crisis happening now in Slovenia, financial. You could basically turn all the pages, but I don't think there's a large Slovenian community in Australia, and therefore the likelihood of a connection is not that great. But being of Greek background, it hit the headlines because there's 200,000 Greeks in Melbourne. And so for somehow, all Greeks were meant to be authorities all of a sudden on what's happening in the EU. I wondered whether the Australian media basically sees a connection. Oh, problems in Greece, there's Greeks here, some sort of connection. I don't know, I don't have any evidence for it. But it seems it has a higher priority, maybe. The crisis in Slovenia, economically at the moment, I don't think you'd find anywhere in the paper, in any of the papers, that it would be reported. I don't have any evidence for mine. It's an assertion, but I wonder whether the strength of the community somewhere may give more impetus for the media to concentrate, especially on the negatives.
I do a fair amount of media interviews, not interviewing journalists, but being interviewed by them. And I find I never get asked the question, tell me a good news story about the European Union. You get contacted by them when Italy can't form a government. I get contacted a lot about that. Or something else about that it relates to a problem. So journalists are problem-driven. Academic speaking, quite, in our responses, we're quite often solution-driven. The journalists are perfectly happy to hear about those potential solutions, and indeed their final question is normally, well, where do you think this is now going to go? Now, I think in a sense, we as academics, those of us who believe in public engagement, should be able to explain the solution, or not, whether there is one, without in any way speaking on behalf of the European Union. We don't work for the European Union. Andrea and Nikolai does that. But I think that it is important for us in any aspect, whether it's a public intellectual or it's just dealing with questions, to deal with those questions and say, well, there is actually a balance that's taking place as well. This is one of the issues that's taking place, but there is a context for that. Now, some good journalists will accept that context and those contexts, and so you'd agree to do another interview with them. I was told in a recent interview on CNBC that I was only an academic, and so I wouldn't know too much about this, so I'm never going to do an interview with that particular group of journalists again. So we can actually, as specialists in our field, use our knowledge and our expertise, not to tell good news stories, because that's not our jobs, but rather to present a balanced account. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I want to say about media and about analysis about the discourse. And I think we have canals start at home, so we receive 45 scanners coming from different sources in Europe. And we have a different analysis, quite a different analysis about what is the way presenting here in Australia and in Europe, different countries in Europe, about politics, social, economics, financial. And I think it's quite right to say that, yes, newspaper, media, have quite a one-way opinion on how is analyzing the situation in Europe. And I think
the analysis can be quite different if you are Eurosceptic or optimist about Europe. And you have to remember for what purpose was created Europe. It was quite big things about peace. And yes, trade, economics, there is a lot of difficulties, quite a lot of different country, culture, and way of seeing things. And it will be difficult to work. But I think in a global world now, we have to try to work, and I think Europe is a good model. There is a lot of things we can still discuss and work about, but and about the youth, I think yes, and for the new generation, I think yes, and all the young ones, they don't have enough, I think yes, information about and work on it, different way. Newspaper, media, TV, or so.
Okay. Good. Comments? Anyone? Questions to our presenters? Yes. Two more, and then we'll wind it up.
Just one brief comment in terms of the geographical distance in terms of Australia and Europe, and that is that in terms of our region, we share an interest in Russia because Russia is also part of Asia and it's also of interest to the EU. So we have this strategic shared interest.
On a positive note, 19th of April, which is Sunday, 19th of May, is the Eurovision in Australia. So I think this is actually Australia is #1 fan of Eurovision outside of Europe, according to the latest statistics. So I think this is an opportunity not only for me as the annual organizer of Eurovision charity event in Canberra, but also of other people around this room to represent Europe in a different way, as a fun, sexy, a bit crazy perhaps, but nevertheless interesting act of engagement. So I invite you all to contribute to that project.
On that positive note, thank you all very much for being here, for contributing. And I'd like to thank all the presenters, and I hope you've gained something out of this symposium today. Thanks very much.